and thank you for joining us for episode 4 of our Overshadowed series, discussing how modern IT and security teams are dealing with the risks of shadow IT. I'm Russ Spitler, CEO and co-founder of Nudge Security, and with me today is Tony Simone, co-founder of Castra Managed Services. Welcome, Tony.
Hey, Russ. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
So today we'll be talking about threat detection and incident response and how difficult this has become as the SaaS attack service in most organizations has exploded. I might remove that qualification and say all organizations, but you can correct me on that if I'm wrong there, Tony. Before we jump in, could you give me a quick overview of the types of services Castra provides and the challenges you help your clients tackle?
Yeah, absolutely. So Castra is an MDR, or Managed Detection and Response, for anybody that maybe isn't familiar with that term. It's a subset of MSSP, right? So our whole focus is on detecting threats in a client environment and responding. And that can be a gamut of different types of response. The way we have structured our service, I think, is a little interesting and a little different than a lot of traditional MSSPs in that we focus very much on transparency and openness and partnership with our clients. It's all about making sure that they own the systems, they own the data, it's co-managed. We work with them and we become an extension of their team. That's our real goal, is for them to feel like we are part of their team. We're in the trenches with them, we're working with them. And then the way we deliver that service is ultimately we build around a SIEM and UEBA core. So that's the real core analytical engine that's going to take in all of that client data and all their telemetry and audit logs and everything else and make sense of it and give us things to react with. And then we add on EDR, XDR, and threat intelligence. And that just enhances the overall detection capabilities that we have and also gives us response capabilities. We can stop endpoints, or we can connect in and lock user accounts or block things on the network or whatever is required. But that's really kind of the core of what we do. And we're very focused on that. We're not trying to be, every possible security tool and product to everybody. We just want to be able to deliver really fantastic threat detection and response.
That's awesome, Tony. And obviously our relationship goes back many years now. And what I would say is, having known and worked with many of your customers, you guys certainly live up to the promise you just described. And
thanks. Appreciate that.
A lot of credit to you and your team as you've built out that business. But what I'd love to understand is kind of, given in your unique position with the work that you've done and the customers you work with over the last 5 years, how have you seen the shift to SaaS and cloud apps change that dynamic in terms of how you're able to deliver MDR and what things you're looking out for in the organizations you're helping to protect?
Oh, yeah. That's a great question, because it's kind of funny when I think back about it. If we go 5 or maybe even like 7, 8 years ago, I can remember very clearly plenty of clients, plenty of CISOs and IT directors and InfoSec folks saying, oh, there's no way I'm putting all my stuff out in the cloud, right? And I need it in my environment. I need control. And at the same time, everybody was already adopting, cloud-based services, whether it was O365 or some of the Google services, or they were moving things in Amazon. But, you look back at that and then you fast forward to now, and the shift has just been dramatic. I mean, even faster than I would have expected. People have just, they came to that realization. It's pretty obvious, honestly. There's a lot of great use cases and reasons why you would do it, but customers can look at, I need X, Y, and Z, and I can either go essentially rent it in the cloud. I can just pay an OpEx for that, rather than paying this massive CapEx to build out all this infrastructure and then have to pay a whole bunch of people to manage it. And the pros really outweigh the cons on that. And so that's exactly what we've seen, is everybody is just moving everything into the cloud at this point. Some customers, especially bigger corporations that have got huge, already built out data centers and a lot of infrastructure, it takes more time for them to do that migration, but every one of them I've talked to, they're doing those migrations.
It's an interesting dynamic, because I think you just kind of hit the nail on the head. Is like, obviously removing that overhead, that sort of capital expenditure that was required for a lot of that is a huge part of the motivation. But the other piece of the puzzle that I've seen increasingly is just the convenience and productivity that comes to those end employees. Right. If I don't have to wait for somebody to throw another server in the rack, and I can get started in 15 minutes. It's a big difference in terms of what's going to get done.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, it's funny because we were having a conversation similar to this with a partner the other day. And one of the things we were discussing in that conversation was that it's become so much easier for the end users, the end companies to pivot very quickly and say, okay, I'm using this service, but there's a similar, but I think better service over here. And they can just pivot to it really quickly. Unlike the old days where it was, you had this huge investment in all this infrastructure and, you would have to change all of that out. And there was just so much more friction in doing those things. And now just in the cloud world, the friction level is so low to be able to just hop to best in breed very quickly. And for the SaaS providers, they can continually update their products, unlike, having to go through massive, they're doing it in the back end, they're doing the patch cycles and everything else. But unlike pushing that out to your end user and forcing them to go through all of their change control and patch cycles and everything else.
It's totally true. But one of the challenges that kind of comes with that is, again, when we first worked together back, I don't know, more than 10 years ago now, it was kind of easy. You say, hey, what's in your data center? What's running in those servers? And let's start getting it integrated into the security analytics. But nowadays, the challenge is way different because that technology is spread all over the place. The owners of that technology is spread all over the organization, and even awareness that is a little bit limited. So as you start a new engagement, how do you get a handle on what technologies are in use and sort of what the true attack surface and what you need to sort of prioritize?
Yeah. It's funny because, think about that, Russ, is like conceptually, it sounds so simple. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with a CISO or a CIO or an IT director or whomever and said, okay, show me your network map and tell me about all the systems you're running. And they'll look at me and go, I know some of them, but I don't know all of them. And especially now with so much of that extruded out to the cloud, that it's like, okay, well, what cloud services are you using? You think, finance might actually know better than the IT directors at some point because they see the bills. But yeah, it's a challenge. And I think this is an area, where us connecting with you guys has really been incredibly helpful because what you bring to the table is so insightful for getting that bigger map of what's out there, what's being used that IT doesn't know about, the shadow IT piece, and all of those things, and seeing what's out there. Because for us as an MDR, we have to know what's out there, because we have to tune the systems. We have to collect the data in the first place, but we also have to tune the systems to know what's in use, what's supposed to be in use, what's no longer in use, those kinds of things. And it's funny because I know there have been times when we've actually detected activity and said, this is weird. There's some anomalous application activity happening here, and we've never seen that before. And we go to the client, they're like, I didn't know we had that. So.
How often does that happen? How often do you end up in those situations where you're finding something that's a normal part of business process, but unaware for your security counterparts in-house?
Yeah, it's definitely not an everyday thing by any means. It's infrequent, but it is something that happens. I think we see it across, probably at least a third or more of our client base where that will happen at some point over the next several months.
That's incredible. So when you think about this, there's another aspect of it, which there was a beautiful opportunity to just go unplug the cables in the data center back when incidents were happening. I always love that GoldenEye scene. If you remember 25 years ago now, poor Boris unplugging cables before he gets frozen. But that changes now. Now that these assets that we're in part protecting are things that are outside of the local network boundary, outside of the traditional sort of safety plugs that we can pull. How has that impacted sort of the threat detection and the incident response that comes to play when you are detecting incidents that span multiple sort of services out there?
Yeah, it's definitely different, right? If we think back to the old days of walking to the data center or the server closet or whatever you've got, it was you would have some equipment or some systems you had put in and installed, and you would be pointing all of your syslog at those systems, right? So your traditional SIEM platforms and threat detection platforms, you're pointing syslog at them, you're pushing log files to them or something, some combination thereof. In the cloud world, and a lot of what we really have is a hybrid world where we're doing that plus, right? And so in the cloud side of things, it's extremely rare to see anybody pushing syslog across the internet. That's, there's a lot of reasons that's a horrible idea. But most of the cloud providers now, it's all via either API calls or some type of tool that's going to fetch the telemetry, the audit data, everything you need as an MDR, as a threat detection service. You'll be fetching all of that. And I will say that, to the vast majority of them, to their credit, I think most of them have really keyed in on the idea of, just clean, well-defined REST APIs or webhooks as a means of getting data to us. So, it's not a huge challenge to get to that. What I have found, though, is one of the biggest challenges is, does the SaaS provider even provide that? Most of the bigger products, absolutely. But some products, they don't even provide a mechanism to do that. And it's not like the old days or that on-prem equipment where even if they didn't provide a way for me to get logs, odds are it was, a Unix box or Windows box, and there were logs sitting somewhere, and we could put an agent in place and grab those logs and feed them over. But with a SaaS platform, you have no control. You're not under the hood at all. So you're really dependent on the provider to do it. The other challenge we've seen, and this is to some of the bigger providers out there, and I won't name any names, but sometimes it becomes a licensing thing, right? You can get the service, you can get the application, the functionality you need for X dollars, but if you want to actually be able to audit what's happening in that environment, you got to buy the bigger license, and then it's a whole additional cost structure there. And a lot of folks don't realize that, or they don't realize it until they've already budgeted for something, and then they go, oh crud, we've got to go pay this much more to make sure that we can actually get data into our SIEM, into our analytical platform, and make it useful. Well, that stinks.
It's a huge challenge, and I have a whole rant on security features that you have to pay for, but that we'll get over that in the next 20 years at least, right?
We hope.
But what would you say is changed in terms of the response side of the equation? Because that's also a bigger challenge as you kind of think about these SaaS services. Have you guys, when you're investigating incidents where you try to figure out what happened, how often do you see SaaS services involved in those incidents, and how does that impact your ability to kind of do response, and what tools you have to do that response?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, it has changed in some ways. Some of the connectivity is still, some of the way that, the mechanics of how it's being done are still very similar. But it also kind of goes back to what I was just saying about even getting telemetry out of these systems. Sometimes the provider may not have provided you with any API mechanisms or any, response mechanisms that you can hook into. Now, again, I think, the landscape has evolved very quickly over the past several years. And for the most part, a lot, especially the big products that everybody's familiar with, there are, normally a stack of APIs that we can hook into to take response actions. So in some ways, it hasn't conceptually changed that much, right? You've detected something and you need to respond. You reach out to that system and say, do this. And it can be locking a user account. It could be, blocking something on the network. It could be locking down an endpoint, running a scan. There's, a million different possibilities. I think the ability to respond and to build the ability to orchestrate responses with modern SOAR platforms, some of which are bolted right into your SIEM platforms, that has really come a long way. It used to be, oh, we need to lock out Bob's account because Bob just got hacked. It's like, okay, well, somebody go get on the Windows console and lock out Bob's account. Now you can automate all of those things, and you can have much more sophisticated decision processes happening in all of that. And so you can trigger off of something and have either a fully or a semi-automated response. And I think that's somewhere where we've definitely, come a long ways. And most of the providers out there, I think, even when they're not always providing good log data, they still have mechanisms in place to disable users, to lock things. But to a little bit of your other point just a second ago, there's also, we do see those as avenues of attack as well, right? So your authentication frameworks that are all SaaS-based now, right? Those are under constant attack. I can't tell you how many customers where they're just getting bombarded with authentication attacks and people trying to get in to their, to their worldwide infrastructure via those types of attacks.
It's kind of interesting, and I love those two dynamics that you brought up. Like, there's obviously a huge improvement as more things are API based, more programmatically connected, etc. But that second piece of the puzzle kind of takes advantage of that as well, which is if I can get a toehold in any one of these services, often there's a lot of lateral movement and opportunity that I have as a result of that. Yeah. And that's you got to take the positives with the negatives there. But the puzzle, from what I see, is understanding what's out there, how it's connected together is such a foundational element of an effective program kind of going forward.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thinking about that, what do you think IT and security teams can do to better prepare for their incidents impacting their SaaS estate?
Yeah, that's a pretty wide open question, honestly. But I mean, there's 100 ways we can go. But I think, for starters, they have to know everything they have, right? And I think that definitely, leans to you guys quite a bit. Knowing what you have, what's out there, what's supposed to be there, what's not supposed to be there, having some controls around all of that, monitoring all of that. Obviously, for myself, I'm a little biased. The monitoring part is really critical to me. That's what I've kind of built my life and my career on. That's important. There's a lot of aspects to it, though, as they go into, if they're going to move something from on-prem to SaaS or from one provider to another, they need to understand the full security functionality of that platform, not just the auditing, logging, and not just the response, but all of the security controls and all of the ability to configure the product in a way that it is properly hardened from day one, and that they continuously monitor that. And then continuously monitor it from a configuration standpoint and a utilization standpoint and a security, auditing standpoint. So there's a lot of pieces there. But I think that's probably a big start for them, is just making sure they know what they have, and for those things that they have, how do they set it up properly? How do they monitor it properly? And how do they continue to adapt to it as it changes?
It's 100% agree with everything you just said there. Part of the challenge that we see and part of the sort of intimidating future is the reality that there's hundreds, if not thousands, of these platforms in use in every organization. And obviously that's part of the thesis, why I started Nudge. But as I look to the future, there's a huge opportunity, but there's a big set of work ahead of us, getting familiarity with all those platforms, ensuring they're properly integrated, understanding that they even exist and how they're integrated together. And I think that ultimately we'll be in a much more secure space in the long term, but there's a lot of work between here and there. Anyways, we could really go on for hours about this topic, but it's time for us to wrap up today. Thanks to everyone for joining. And Tony, thanks for being a guest. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, and hope we can see you soon.
Yeah, likewise, Russ. I appreciate the conversation. It was great, and good to see you again.
Stay tuned for future episodes of Overshadowed, and hope you can join us again soon. Thanks a lot.